Some ideas are loud. They're the ones that trend, they get talked about everywhere, and then they kind of fade away. But then there are the quiet ones, the foundational ideas that almost invisibly build things that actually last. And that's really what we're here to understand.
It's a question worth asking, right? Especially in a world that's always celebrating visible action and, immediate results. What's the unseen architecture, that quality of thinking, that allows some ventures and even some careers to last for decades?
We like to call it the invisible foundation. It's this framework of core principles that supports every single decision long before you ever see the first action being taken.
This right here is the quiet truth at the very heart of what we're exploring. We're trying to look past the tactics, past the quarterly results, to really get at the principles, the ways of seeing the world that guided those crucial decisions, not just once, but consistently over a long, long time.
If you look around, most of the professional world is geared towards execution. It's about getting things done, being efficient, focusing on output. And of course, that's absolutely essential. But the real, lasting advantage? That often comes from a totally different starting point, a deep, almost obsessive focus on the quality of the thinking before any of the doing happens.
So, that brings us to a really key question. Why do some ways of thinking last, while others just fade away with the next business cycle? What gives them that staying power?
We all feel this, don't we? The whole landscape is in constant motion. The tools we mastered just 5 years ago are already evolving. Markets are always shifting, and new technology just accelerates everything. So any strategy that's tied only to a specific tool or a specific moment in time, well, it's going to have a really short shelf life.
You see, enduring ideas aren't really about technology. They're about people. They're principles that are anchored in the parts of human nature that don't get a software update. Our motivations, our fears, how we assess risk, and what truly drives us. And that's exactly why they stay relevant generation after generation.
And just to be clear, our purpose here isn't to create some highlight reel of famous leaders. It's really to deconstruct the cause and effect. We want to understand the logic, the machinery of the idea itself, not just stand back and admire the result it produced.
Now, this focus on foundational thinking isn't just some historical curiosity. It's actually becoming the new competitive edge, especially in this AI-shaped world that we're all trying to navigate right now.
Just think about the modern landscape for a second. With incredibly powerful tools like AI becoming available to almost everyone, the advantage of simply having access is shrinking fast. The barrier to producing things is lower than it's ever been. So the true differentiator is shifting from who has the best tools to who has the clearest thinking to guide them.
And all of this leads us away from that culture of urgency and constant hustle. The goal isn't just to move faster, but to build better. It's to surface ideas that compound over a career, the kind of thinking that builds on itself, giving you more clarity and better judgment over time.
With that in mind, we'd like to invite you to approach this series not just as something to consume, but as something to really reflect on. The real value often comes in those moments when an idea just clicks, or maybe when it challenges an old assumption you didn't even know you had. Those are the moments worth pausing on.
So this is the journey we're on together. In each segment, we're going to focus on one core foundational idea. We'll explore where it came from, why it worked, and what it can teach us about the challenges that we're all facing today.
The natural question then is, where do we begin?
We'll start with the concept that's so fundamental, it quietly reshaped the entire nature of modern management. It's an idea that, once you really see it, changes how you understand the role of any leader in any organization. We'll explore that next.
Today, we're going to dig into an idea that's, it's fundamental to management. It's this quiet but incredibly powerful distinction between managing for control and leading from a place of responsibility. And once you see it, it kind of changes everything about how you look at work.
So it's worth just pausing for a second on this. What is management's true purpose? What is it really for? Because how we answer that, well, it shapes entire organizations, it shapes our careers, and, the quality of our day-to-day lives at work.
Okay, so to really get a handle on where we're going with this, we first have to look back at where we've come from. Let's talk about the model that basically built the industrial world, and it's a model that was completely rooted in this idea of control. Now, this old view, it's not that it was wrong exactly, it was just, a product of its time. Think about it. For an era of really standardized, predictable tasks, leadership was all about that clear, top-down hierarchy. The main goal was predictability, right?
And the tools you'd use for that? Well, they were control and supervision.
But then, of course, the nature of work started to shift. And as it did, our whole understanding of management had to change with it. This is where a really key thinker, Peter Drucker, comes into the picture. He offered a profoundly different way to look at all this. It was a pretty radical redefinition of what a manager's role is even supposed to be.
Just let that sink in for a second. Management's role is to make people productive, not obedient. Productive, not obedient. Wow, that one sentence, it just marks this huge, fundamental shift in perspective. It completely reframes the purpose of management. We're moving away from enforcement and towards enablement.
And this really lays out the contrast, doesn't it? On one side, you've got this system of external pressure, right? Control, supervision, hierarchy, and it's all aimed at getting one thing, obedience. But on the other side, you have a system designed to unlock something internal. It's about giving responsibility, clarifying purpose. It's a totally different game. One is about managing bodies in a factory line. The other is about leading minds. Okay, so we have these two kind of competing philosophies. But why does this actually matter? Like in the real world, day to day. Is this just a nice idea? No way. This isn't just a debate about words. The consequences here are absolutely profound. The reason Drucker's idea is so incredibly powerful is that it aligns with a fundamental truth about people, right? Think about yourself. We don't do our best work when we're just being compliant, just following orders. We hit our peak when we actually understand the goal, when we're trusted to figure out the best way to get there, and when we feel like our contribution actually means something. And here's the brass tacks, the practical outcome. Organizations that really get this, they're the ones that can scale. They can grow without completely collapsing under the weight of their own bureaucracy. Why? Because they're not relying on just a few people at the top to control everything. Instead, they're pushing responsibility out, distributing it, and that's what builds resilience. That's what sparks innovation. But here's the thing about powerful ideas. They can get forgotten, especially when the pressure is on or when things get really complex. The default human instinct for a lot of us is to just revert back to control, to tighten the reins. And in today's workplace, the price you pay for going back to that old model, it's higher than it has ever been.
And this is maybe the most crucial point for right now. The kind of work that most of us do today, knowledge work, stuff that needs creativity and judgment and real problem solving, it simply cannot be managed through control. It just doesn't work. You can't command someone to have a great idea. It's impossible. All you can do is create the conditions, the environment, where a great idea is more likely to happen.
So what happens when we forget this? Well, we kick off what you might call a downward spiral. When you try to apply those old models of control to the new ways of working, you don't get order. What you get is friction. You get resistance.
And the signs, the symptoms of all that friction, man, they are probably all too familiar to many of us. Burnout, disengagement, that feeling of just suffocating bureaucracy. And here's the key. These aren't just separate, isolated problems that you can fix with a new wellness program or something. No. They are the direct result of a management philosophy that is completely at odds with the very work it's trying to support.
So, at the end of the day, getting through all this complexity, it really requires a shift in our own thinking. The most effective people I've seen, whether they're just starting out or they're senior leaders, they all focus their energy on one thing: enabling outcomes, not on exercising authority. Their first question is always, okay, what needs to happen here? Not who's in charge. That's a huge difference.
And that really leaves us with a final question, something to reflect on. Think of it as a lens you can use to look at your own work, your own team, your own organization. In your day-to-day, in the meetings you run, the decisions you make, are you really enabling outcomes? Or are you, maybe even without realizing it, just enforcing authority? The answer to that question, well, that can show us the way forward.
There's a subtle paradox right at the heart of achievement. We spend so much of our lives building things, careers, companies, routines, all to create a sense of safety, of stability. And yet, it's often inside those very structures of success that the biggest risks start to grow, quietly, almost unnoticed. Today, we're going to explore that tension, the relationship between the comfort we work so hard to find and the awareness we absolutely need to survive. Success, it's the destination, right? The result of all the effort and strategy. It feels like you're finally on solid ground, a place where you can feel confident. But here's the thing. Every environment shapes how we see the world, and the environment of success is no different.
And that brings us to the real question we need to consider. Because if success gives us security, but that security starts to dull our senses, have we actually built a fortress, or have we built a really elegant trap for ourselves?
So let's dive into that a little bit. Let's really look at this environment of success more closely. The rewards for getting things right are obvious. They're tangible. But the side effects, well, they're often invisible, at least for a while. And look, this isn't some kind of moral failing. It's just a deeply human response. When your view of the world gets validated over and over again, you naturally stop questioning it. You build these mental models that work really, really well, for a time. The danger comes when you start to mistake your map for the entire territory.
So this really sets up two very different ways of operating. Comfort, well, that's a passive state. It just assumes things will stay stable and it relies on what's worked in the past. Vigilance, on the other hand, is an active state. It's this quiet, constant engagement with what's happening right now, assuming that change is the only thing that's truly constant. And to be clear, this isn't a state of anxiety. It's a state of deep, profound awareness.
Okay, so if complacency is the natural byproduct of success, then we need an intentional antidote. And this brings us to a really powerful and I think often misunderstood idea about what it really takes to navigate complexity and sustain that success for the long haul.
Now, this quote from Intel's legendary CEO, Andy Grove. It can sound pretty jarring, can't it? It sounds like he's advocating for a life lived in fear. But what Grove actually meant was much more nuanced and frankly far more useful as a strategic way of thinking.
You see, he wasn't talking about emotional paranoia, that gut-wrenching, irrational fear. Not at all. He was describing a form of strategic paranoia, a relentless, disciplined habit of questioning your own assumptions. It's a commitment to being intellectually alert, especially when everything seems to be going perfectly.
And this right here is the key distinction. Strategic paranoia isn't driven by a fear of what might go wrong. It's driven by a deep respect for the simple fact that you don't know everything and you can't know everything. It's a kind of intellectual humility that keeps you open, keeps you observant.
So why is this kind of alertness so critical right now? Because the very nature of the threats and the opportunities we all face has fundamentally changed. The world just rarely sends a clear warning shot anymore. When you look at these huge, successful companies that eventually falter, it's almost never because of one single bad decision. It's because their very success created a culture that became deaf to new information. The core assumptions that fueled their rise became articles of faith, and that insulated them from the subtle shifts that were happening all around them.
Think about it. In the past, a big disruption often felt like an announced battle. A new competitor would show up and basically declare war. But today, disruption is much quieter. It's a gradual shift in how customers behave, a subtle tech advance happening on the periphery, a slow erosion of something you thought was valuable. It doesn't announce itself, it just emerges.
And this is where the true strategic advantage lies today. Vigilance is the cultivated skill of hearing those weak signals, the little anomalies, the quiet trends, the things that don't quite fit the story you've been telling yourself. It's really about catching the scent of rain in the air long before the storm arrives.
So this isn't about putting yourself in a temporary high-stress state of alert. That's not sustainable. It's about building a sustainable, ongoing discipline. It's about designing an architecture of awareness right into your daily work and your daily thinking. This requires a pretty profound shift in mindset. We tend to think that clarity means finding the right answers, but answers can become rigid, they become outdated. True, lasting clarity actually comes from the continuous process of asking better questions, questions that challenge our own certainties.
This practice really has three core parts. First, you have to actively question your assumptions, the things you just know are true. Second, you have to observe the edges. That's where the future is quietly taking shape. And finally, you have to consciously maintain perspective, always remembering that your current view is just one of many possible views.
And that brings this whole idea right back to us, right here, in this moment. The greatest risk we face often lies in the belief we're most comfortable with, the one thing we are least likely to ever examine. So perhaps the best place to begin this practice of vigilance is with that simple, quiet question. Today, I want to explore a quiet but incredibly powerful force that exists in any organization. It's this tension, this pull between what feels stable on the inside and what actually creates value on the outside. It's a dynamic that I think can really define the difference between long-term relevance and, well, a slow, comfortable decline.
So let's just start with a framing question. Where does true sustainable value really come from? I mean, is it something you find inside the walls of an organization, in all its efficiencies and processes? Or is it actually found somewhere else entirely? Let's just hold that thought as we move forward.
You know, every successful organization feels it. It's this natural, almost gravitational pull inward. It's a desire to protect what you've built, to optimize what's already working. We're going to start by looking at this pull towards stability, because really, understanding it is the first step to being able to see beyond it.
There's actually a term for this phenomenon. It's called internal optimization bias, and this isn't a sign of failure, not at all. In a lot of ways, it's a direct consequence of success. I mean, think about it. When you've found a model that's profitable, the most logical thing in the world is to protect it. You start focusing on defending your margins, streamlining your routines. The entire system kind of designs itself to get better and better at doing what it already does.
But here's where the perspective really shifts. That fortress of efficiency, the one you've built to protect everything that is, well, it can look very, very different from the outside. What feels like a strength internally can, from another point of view, start to look a lot like an opportunity.
And this brings us to one of the most powerful business insights of the modern era, famously summed up by Jeff Bezos. Your margin is my opportunity. Now, this isn't just some clever phrase. It is a complete reframing of the entire competitive landscape. It suggests that a high profit margin isn't just a sign of your strength. It's also a measure of the value an organization is keeping for itself instead of passing it on to the customer. And that gap, that's exactly where the opportunity lies.
So that single insight becomes the foundation for a whole new kind of strategy, one that deliberately chooses customer value over internal comfort. It's a mindset that's willing to sacrifice its own margins, its own operational ease, all in the service of creating a better experience for the customer.
This really reveals two fundamentally different scoreboards, doesn't it? On one side, you have the organization that's measuring its own internal health, its margins, its efficiency, its predictability. And on the other side, you have an innovator who's measuring the customer's experience, their ease, their satisfaction, how their needs are evolving. It's like one is looking in the mirror and the other is looking out the window.
And this illustrates the whole disruptive mechanism perfectly. It starts with the successful company focusing on internal optimization, which, again, is a totally natural impulse. But as a result, these little gaps in the customer experience start to appear, and then they grow. And finally, a customer-obsessed innovator sees those gaps not as minor problems, but as the very entry point into the market. This is the story of Amazon, over and over and over again.
So this all brings us to a really powerful mental model. It suggests that maybe we should reframe our entire perception of stability. What if that feeling of comfort, that feeling of things being stable, isn't a sign that everything is right, but is instead a quiet warning that we've stopped looking outward?
This leads us to what might be one of the greatest risks for any established leader or organization, the slow decline that's disguised as stability. It's so dangerous because it doesn't feel like a crisis. There are no alarms ringing. The numbers might even look pretty good. But just beneath the surface, your relevance is quietly eroding.
And this is where that disconnect becomes so dangerous. Internally, all the metrics for stability, things like profitability and efficiency, they can stay high, giving us this feeling of safety. But externally, our connection to the market, our actual relevance to a customer whose world is constantly changing, that may have already dropped significantly. This gap right here, this is where the real risk lives.
And this is why that vigilance is so critical. Because customer expectations are never static. They are a constantly moving target. What was absolutely delightful last year is just standard this year, and it's probably a disappointment next year. So past success isn't just a poor predictor of future relevance. It can actually blind us to what's happening right now.
Ultimately, this points to the real work of an effective leader, doesn't it? It's the capacity to think beyond the internal scoreboard, to constantly fight that gravitational pull inward, and to intentionally, deliberately see the organization from the outside in, through the eyes of the customer.
And that leaves us with a final lingering question to consider in our own work. Is the place where we feel the most safe, the most stable, the most comfortable, is it possible that that's actually the very place from which our next competitor is planning their launch?
Let's take a moment to explore an idea that runs counter to almost everything our professional world seems to demand from us, the quiet and truly profound power of patience.
You know, we're all constantly being pushed to move faster, to deliver sooner. But it's worth pausing to ask a really fundamental question. Is this relentless obsession with speed actually creating real, lasting value?
Or could it be, quietly undermining the very things we're trying so hard to build?
For anyone working today, there's this powerful force always at play. You could call it the gravity of the present. It's that constant, undeniable pressure to show results right now, to answer the most urgent demand, and to prove your worth today. This pressure is very real, and it shapes our decisions probably more than we realize.
And this number, 90, well, it often defines the horizon of that pressure. I'm talking about the 90-day quarterly cycle. It's become the metronome of modern business, a rhythm that forces our strategic thinking into these really short windows. When every 90 days feels like a final exam, it becomes incredibly difficult to look years, let alone decades ahead.
And this kind of pressure, it creates a core problem. When urgency becomes the main metric, what you get is speed, but often without any clear long-term direction. It feels productive, right? We're busy, we're reacting, we're moving. But so often, this frantic activity just amounts to running in place, mistaking motion for real, meaningful progress.
Now, this idea stands in stark contrast to a philosophy from one of the world's most successful long-term thinkers. Warren Buffett's insight here isn't just about stocks. It's a fundamental principle about value itself. It suggests that patience isn't just passive waiting. It's actually an active, deliberate strategy.
And that brings us to the principle of compounding. We usually hear about it in finance, but its true power is strategic, and it's deeply human. Compounding is this quiet, almost invisible force where small, consistent, well-aimed efforts build on themselves. Over time, they create this extraordinary and totally disproportionate value. It's the exact opposite of the big, flashy short-term win. It's how deep expertise, trust, and real reputations are actually built.
This is how enduring organizations are built. Seriously. They operate on a completely different clock. Their most critical decisions are aligned with a vision that spans decades, not just the next reporting quarter. They invest in things that take years to mature, relationships, core capabilities, brands, because they understand that's where real, unshakable value comes from.
So, this is the crucial question, isn't it? If the logic is so sound and the results are so profound, why do so few people and organizations truly operate this way? Well, the answer, it turns out, has a lot less to do with business strategy and a whole lot more to do with human nature.
Every one of us faces this internal conflict. On one side, you've got the powerful, almost biological pull of the urgent reward, the quick win, that immediate validation that feels so good. And on the other side, there's the quiet, difficult discipline of delayed gratification that's required to build important, lasting value. And let's be honest, choosing that second path, it goes against some of our deepest instincts.
And when that internal conflict consistently favors the urgent, it carries a heavy external cost. It leads to these reactive pivots based on short-term noise, which in turn creates strategic instability. Teams can never gain traction because the direction is always changing. And ultimately, this cycle doesn't just fail to create value, it actively destroys it.
So, if we can learn to navigate that internal conflict and choose the more difficult path, what's the reward? Well, we can think of it as the dividend of patience. It's the payoff that comes not just from waiting, but from intentionally and deliberately expanding our time horizon.
This dividend pays out in three really crucial ways. First, a longer time horizon brings stability, so you're not constantly thrown off course by every bit of short-term noise. From that stability comes clarity, real clarity about what truly matters. And from that clarity, you build lasting influence, because your actions become consistent and coherent. The key takeaway here is that patience isn't just a virtue, it's a massive competitive advantage.
And that really just leaves us with a final thought to reflect on. Beyond the next project, beyond the next quarter, or even the next year, what is the work, the relationship, or the legacy that you could build if you simply decided to give it more time?
In a world that feels like it's constantly accelerating, it can be really grounding to think about the ideas that don't change, the principles of leadership, of organizational health, that seem to operate with the same consistency as a law of nature. Today, I want to explore one of the most powerful of these, a quiet observation that really governs relevance and, when you get down to it, survival. When the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. Now, that isn't a threat, it's not some kind of command, it's really just an observation, almost like a law of physics for organizations. It points to this really delicate balance. And when that balance is lost, a process of decline quietly begins,
often long before anyone on the inside even notices something's wrong. And that quiet decline, it starts with a central tension. It's one that every successful professional, every established organization eventually has to face. It's this growing gap between the pace of the outside world and our own internal rhythm. And if we don't address it, that gap can become a chasm. Think about it like this. On one side, you've got the external world. Markets, technology, what customers expect, it's all in a state of constant acceleration. But on the other side, you have the internal world. The processes, the culture, the legacy systems, all the things that created success in the past, well, they now exert this powerful gravitational pull toward the familiar, toward a comfortable stagnation.
The real power in what Welch observed is what it tells us about relevance itself. It shows us that relevance isn't lost in some single dramatic event. No, it's lost in a slow, almost imperceptible drift away from the world as it's becoming.
There's a name for this internal slowdown: organizational inertia. And here's the real paradox. It's rarely a sign of failure. It's almost always a byproduct of success. The very systems, the processes, the beliefs that made an organization great become the anchors that hold it in place while the world just moves on.
So what's the cost of this inertia? Well, it's almost never a sudden collapse. It's more like an invisible erosion, a really subtle cause and effect chain of decline that can be nearly impossible to see from the inside until it's far, far too late.
Let's just walk through how this actually happens. It starts with something that feels noble, protecting what works. You know, the legacy systems, the proven models. But as the external world keeps accelerating, this act of protection leads to an invisible loss of connection. Relevance starts to erode. And that erosion, that quiet disconnect, that is the true beginning of the decline.
Now, this timeless principle has never been more important than it is right now. That gap Welch warned us about isn't just some theoretical concept today. It's being actively widened by a powerful new force, which makes all of this an urgent modern imperative.
Just take a moment and think about what that force might be in your own industry. What is the great accelerator that's dramatically speeding up the rate of change on the outside for you?
For almost all of us, the answer is AI. Artificial intelligence is that modern force. It's magnifying the gap between the external and internal worlds, making the need for conscious, deliberate, internal adaptation more critical than it has ever been before.
And this connects directly to the fundamental responsibility of leadership today. The work isn't just about managing the present anymore. It's about initiating change internally before you're forced to by external pressures. Proactive adaptation. That's the central task of navigating our complex world.
So this leads us to the essential question, right? How do we increase our internal rate of change? The answer, I think, is simpler and yet more profound than we might think. It suggests that the most important adaptation isn't about the tools we use, but about the mindset we bring to them.
The crucial point is this. We have to adapt our thinking before we adapt our tools. Real, true adaptation doesn't start with adopting new software or a new platform. It starts with changing how we think, how we learn, and how we lead. The tools are always secondary to the mindset that's wielding them. Ultimately, this all comes down to a really critical distinction in mindset. A culture that's built on knowing is anchored in the past. It tries to protect legacy and optimize what it already understands. But a culture built on learning, well, that's oriented toward the future. It fuels the internal rate of change because it's constantly asking, okay, what's next?
And so, all of this leaves us with a simple, personal question to reflect on. It's a question for us as individuals and, of course, for the organizations we're a part of. Is your rate of learning keeping pace with the rate of change in the world? Because the answer to that question really holds the key to enduring relevance.
You know, we're here to explore a simple, but I think really profound idea. It's the notion that, in a world that's in constant motion, our ability to learn is just so much more valuable than what we already happen to know.
So let's start with a question, one to kind of hold in our minds as we go. When does our greatest strength, our expertise, actually become our biggest weakness? It's a subtle trap, but it's one that's surprisingly easy to fall into. And this brings us right to what we might call the expertise paradox. This is really the central tension that we need to unpack and understand.
As professionals, we all feel it, right? That immense pressure to be the expert, to be the one with the answer.
But over time, that very expertise can turn into a kind of fortress. We build up these walls to protect what we know, and in doing so, we don't realize that we're walling ourselves off from new ideas, from fresh perspectives, and ultimately from our own growth. This really boils down to two opposing mindsets. On one side, you've got the know-it-all culture. It's built on this idea that knowledge is static, it's a territory you have to defend, and that makes it incredibly fragile. But on the other side, you have the learn-it-all culture, which just thrives on curiosity and, well, humility. It sees knowledge as infinite, and because of that, it's resilient, it's adaptive.
A culture of knowing is, just by its very nature, unsustainable. It tends to breed arrogance, which then leads to defensiveness anytime existing beliefs get challenged. And that combination is just a perfect recipe for stagnation. I mean, if you think you already know everything, there's literally no room left to learn. Growth is just completely blocked.
So, what's the alternative? This leads us to our main case study here, the deliberate shift toward a culture of curiosity.
Let's think about Microsoft back in the early 2010s. A true giant, no doubt, but a giant that was pretty much trapped by its own past success. Its big revival wasn't just about new products or a slicker business strategy. No, it was rooted in something much, much deeper, a profound cultural diagnosis. They came to realize the problem wasn't external, it was internal.
The core insight that really drove this whole change was put perfectly by Satya Nadella, and this wasn't just some clever catchphrase for a poster. It actually became the new operating system for the entire organization, a fundamental move away from certainty and toward curiosity.
So that begs the question, right? What are the actual tangible consequences of embracing curiosity? What really happens when an entire culture makes this kind of fundamental shift?
The mechanism for the change was, at its heart, simple but just incredibly powerful. It was all about replacing one core behavior with another. So wherever they found defensiveness, that instinct to protect an idea or a past win, they consciously worked to replace it with curiosity, the instinct to ask questions, to explore other possibilities.
And that shift, right there, became the real engine of Microsoft's revival. It wasn't about one single tactic. It was about changing how thousands of people behaved in meetings, in code reviews, in everyday conversations. It was a change in human behavior that unlocked collaboration, sparked innovation, and in the end, led to their renewed success.
Okay, so what does all this mean for us, as professionals and leaders today? Well, this brings us to this idea of leading from a place of uncertainty.
This kind of mindset, it's no longer just a nice to have. Honestly, it's become an imperative. With the rise of AI and just the dizzying pace of change, static knowledge has an incredibly short half-life. The world we live in now actively punishes a know-it-all stance.
This really redefines what leadership even looks like. Learning stops being just a skill. It becomes a core leadership trait. It's about the capacity to stay open, to adapt your thinking, to really listen and to evolve, especially when you don't have all the answers. The best leaders today, they're not the ultimate experts anymore. They're the lead learners.
Maybe the core principle in all of this is just this. True growth, whether it's for you, your team, or your whole organization, it rarely happens inside the comfort zone of what you already know. It begins right at the edge of your certainty.
And so, I'll leave you with a final thought to carry forward with you. Take a look at your own work, your team, your own deep-seated assumptions. Where have you built a fortress of expertise? And where, in order for growth to begin, does your certainty need to end?
You know, there's this quiet but really powerful idea, one that completely changes how you think about innovation, about competition, and even about risk. It really gets to the heart of how change actually happens. And that's what we're going to unpack today. We hear the term disruption all the time, right? And we usually picture these huge, dramatic moments. But this quote from Clayton Christensen, it points to something much quieter, much more subtle. Disruption is a process, not an event. It's not a lightning strike. It's the tide slowly coming in. So that really brings up a critical question for any of us, really. If the biggest, most impactful changes start out so quietly, almost invisibly, how do we even begin to notice them? And that question, it kind of goes against the usual story we tell ourselves about how industries get shaken up. So before we get into the reality of it, let's talk about that story we all know. Let's talk about the myth of disruption, the one that feels like it's straight out of a movie. Right, the myth frames disruption as this bolt from the blue, a complete shock to the system that just appears out of nowhere, catching everyone totally off guard. And in this version of the story, some unknown competitor just emerges and bam, seemingly overnight, they take down an industry giant. It's all about speed and drama. It's a really compelling story, for sure. But is that how it really works? The thing is, the drama of that narrative often hides what's actually going on underneath. The reality, it's usually a lot less cinematic, but honestly, it's way more useful to understand. Okay, so we've looked at the myth. Now let's turn to the process that Christensen actually saw happening over and over again. It's a pattern that's way more gradual, and once you see it, it's surprisingly predictable. So, at its core, disruptive innovation isn't really about building a better mousetrap for the same old customers. It actually starts by serving the customers that everyone else is ignoring, the ones at the fringes. It gets its first foothold not by being better in the way we usually think, but by being simpler or more convenient or maybe just a lot cheaper. And this whole process, it unfolds in stages. It doesn't happen all at once. First, it just looks like an insignificant little signal, noise really. Then it finds a small, niche foothold in the market. Over time, that simple little tool or service gets better and better. It becomes a platform, a new standard. And then finally, the whole market's center of gravity shifts. The world that the big established company knew, it's been completely redefined, but from the outside in. So if this process is something you can actually observe, it raises a really big question for any established company, right? Why is this pattern so consistently missed by the very leaders who have everything to lose? Well, the answer really comes down to perspective. It's about where you're looking. On one side, you've got the incumbents, and they are quite rationally focused on their core market. That's where the high-margin customers are, where the data is clear. But then you look over at the margins, and what do you see? Low-margin experiments, unclear signals. It all looks, insignificant. So it's a completely rational, data-driven decision to ignore it. And that's the trap. It's not a failure of smarts, it's a failure of perspective. And it's driven by perfectly logical choices. Think about it. The very things that make a new idea disruptive, its initial simplicity, its tiny market, the fact that it doesn't perform as well at first, those are the exact same things that make it look non-threatening. It's almost like it's camouflaged as being unimportant. And the cost of this blind spot, you don't feel it right away. It just builds up over time, and eventually it leads to a full-blown crisis. And what happens then? You get late reactions, costly, panicked pivots, and the slow dawning realization that the competitive advantage you once had is gone, and getting it back is incredibly hard. So, really understanding this process, it invites us to shift our thinking. It's about moving away from this default mode of just reacting to things, and towards something more like thoughtful, intentional vigilance. And this really is a choice in how you lead. A reactive posture. As you can see here, it waits for certainty. It waits until everyone else is doing it. It protects the core business at all costs. But a vigilant posture, that's different. It learns to actually explore uncertainty. It pays deliberate attention to what's happening on the periphery. It understands the huge value of learning from small bets out on the edges. This isn't about trying to predict the future with some kind of crystal ball. The real advantage comes from developing the ability to just see the present more clearly, to recognize the importance of those small signals that almost everyone else is dismissing as just noise. And so this all leaves us with a pretty fundamental shift in focus. The goal isn't to be constantly looking for the next big earthquake. It's about learning how to feel the subtle tremors that are already happening right now in those quiet margins. So the question I'll leave you with is this. What's a quiet change out there that truly deserves your attention today? There's this quiet tension in the professional world, an idea that's so common we almost never stop to actually question it. It's this assumption that leadership is something you're given, like a box on an org chart. But what if the real source of influence, of true leadership, comes from somewhere else entirely? Let's just spend a few minutes exploring that. And really, what this all comes down to is a simple but really profound distinction. On one side, you've got position. That's the chair you sit in, right? The title on your email signature. And on the other side, there's direction, a clear, compelling vision of a future that, it doesn't exist yet. It's so easy to mix these two up, to think that having a position automatically gives you direction. But I think, as many of us have probably experienced, that's just not how it works. So, this brings us to our first real point of reflection, this constant tug of war between authority and influence. This is where we can start to see that maybe, just maybe, real leadership isn't about the power you hold, but about the clarity you can provide. Look, a title can get people to do things. It can compel compliance, for sure. It can make sure tasks get checked off a list. But what it can't do, not on its own, is inspire genuine followship. We've all seen it, right? Leaders in high positions who have very little real influence, and then you see individuals with no formal authority at all who just naturally guide how a team thinks and acts. The key thing to remember is that influence isn't assigned, it's earned. It grows out of things like trust and respect and this feeling of a shared purpose. Okay, so to make this idea a bit more concrete, let's look at a really well-known example. And the point here isn't to copy him, but to use this as a kind of lens to think with. This principle comes from Steve Jobs, who, you could argue, understood this difference between authority and influence better than almost anyone. Let's just sit with that for a second. Innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower. What's so fascinating about this quote is that he's not just talking about new gadgets or cool tech. Innovation, in this sense, is about a new way of thinking. It's the act of providing a new direction, of seeing a path forward that other people just don't see yet. And that very act of creating a path where there wasn't one before, that is the essence of leadership. At Apple, this idea was basically everything. It wasn't about chasing 1,000 good ideas. It was about having one single, powerful vision that acted like a filter for every single decision. That vision gave them the story, the why behind all the hard work. It meant that execution wasn't just a list of tasks, but this collective push to make a very specific, shared future a reality. In a way, the vision itself was the lead. But of course, leading with a strong vision, it's not some simple, easy path. It comes with a price. It creates a kind of friction that's just an inevitable part of making any real progress. And this is something I think a lot of experienced professionals know all too well. Anytime you try to make a meaningful change, any true innovation, it is going to invite resistance. It has to. It challenges the way things are, it questions the processes everyone is comfortable with, and it asks people to leave the safety of what they already know. So this resistance, it isn't necessarily a sign you're on the wrong path. A lot of the time, it's actually the clearest sign that you're doing more than just maintaining the status quo. You're actually forging a new path. And this is the great paradox, isn't it? While all that external friction is very real, the internal effect of having that clear vision is this incredibly profound loyalty. People are just drawn to clarity and to purpose. A compelling direction creates this powerful sense of belonging and commitment among the people who share it. It builds a bond that no amount of formal authority ever could. So, if a clear vision creates both this friction and this deep loyalty, what does that mean for us in our day-to-day? Well, it brings us to our final and maybe most practical idea, that we don't lead from a position. We lead from the quality of our own thinking. Ultimately, the most powerful leadership tool any of us have is our ability to think with clarity and intention. It's about being able to understand complexity, to simplify it for others, and to articulate a clear way forward. That is how we provide direction. And it doesn't matter if you're leading a whole company, a small team, or really just your own career. The influence you have is a direct reflection of the quality and the clarity of your thinking. And so that's really the question to leave with. The question isn't, what is my title or what is my position? The question is, where is my thinking leading? Because that is where you're leading others, whether you intend to or not.
You know, we're often handed these rules for leadership, these playbooks we're supposed to follow. But what if the most effective path isn't a path at all? Let's just take a moment here to step back and re-examine the very foundation of what it means to lead. And really, it all boils down to this one question, doesn't it? Because how we answer this, well, it shapes every single decision we make as leaders. Do we see leadership as a fixed blueprint, something to be built and executed? Or is it more like a conversation, something that lives and breathes and adapts? Let's explore that idea for a bit. For the longest time, that blueprint model has really been the dominant idea. This belief that there's some kind of universal formula for leadership. And it's appealing, right? I mean, it feels safe, it feels predictable. But as we're about to see, it's a pretty fragile myth. And this is exactly where the tension lies. On one side, you have the machinery of leadership, all the fixed formulas and the rigid procedures. And on the other, you have the living, breathing organism of a team, the human context, which demands awareness and adaptation. The friction between these two is where so many leadership strategies just fall apart.
Okay, so if the blueprint model is incomplete, where do we turn? The alternative isn't about finding a new set of rules. It's about a shift in perspective. It's a decision to start looking at leadership through a more human lens.
This idea, inspired by the way former PepsiCo CEO Endra Nui thinks, really gets to the heart of it. It suggests that real leadership isn't about imposing a single style. It's about adapting to the reality of what's right in front of you, the specific person, the unique moment, and the context that holds it all together.
And there's actually a name for this: contextual leadership. It's simply the practice of grounding our decisions in empathy and then adapting our approach to fit the situation. It's a huge shift in the guiding question, from what does the rule book say to what does this situation and this person truly need from me right now. And look, this isn't some high-level abstract theory. It's a practice, and it begins with the most fundamental skill any of us have: listening. And I don't mean listening just to form a reply. I mean listening purely to understand. That simple act of understanding, that's the soil where everything else, emotional intelligence, empathy, adaptation, can finally start to grow.
So what happens when you actually lead this way? What's the real outcome? It isn't just about better performance in the short term. It's the creation of something far more valuable, something much more enduring, and that's trust. You see, when context starts to guide our leadership, the very currency of the organization begins to change. Fear, which is really the engine of compliance in rigid systems, gets replaced by trust. And that trust, well, that becomes the foundation for everything that actually matters: genuine engagement, courageous innovation, and deep, lasting loyalty.
You can almost see a clear path emerge here, can't you? It all starts with that empathetic listening. That listening then informs an adaptive action. And consistent, thoughtful action is what earns trust over time. This is how you build true organizational resilience. The ability to weather storms that those rigid, fear-based structures they simply can't.
And let's be clear, this isn't just some nice-to-have philosophy. It's become a strategic necessity, especially now. In our complex, often hybrid work environments, that old blueprint model it's broken. Context, empathy, and trust are pretty much the only tools that allow us to lead effectively across all that distance and difference. But it's just as important to understand the flip side. What's the cost of ignoring all this? What happens when we try to hold on to those old, rigid formulas?
Well, without context, a gap, a chasm, just opens up between a leader and their team. Leaders who rely on a universal rule book, they inevitably become disconnected from the real lived experience of their people. Their decisions start to feel arbitrary, their feedback misses the mark, and pretty soon they just seem out of touch. And that feeling of disconnection, it has a very real, very tangible cost. You've heard the saying, people don't leave companies, they leave managers. But to be more accurate, they leave managers who don't understand them. Disconnection is a direct path to attrition because your best people will always seek out environments where they feel seen, heard, and trusted.
And so, here we are, right back where we started. In the end, it all seems to come down to a question of context. You know, maybe the most important thing to walk away with is this. We're often presented with a false choice between being an effective leader and being a human leader. But the two aren't in opposition. They're completely intertwined. True, sustainable effectiveness is simply impossible without acknowledging and adapting to the humanity of the people we're privileged to lead. So, I'm not going to leave you with a rule to follow, but instead, just a quiet question to carry with you. In your work, on your teams, in your own leadership, where is that human context most needed right now? Thanks for reflecting on this with me. So today, let's talk about something that's at the very heart of building anything worthwhile. It's about how we make those big, high-stakes decisions, especially when the path forward is anything but clear. We're going to explore that quiet, internal work of finding conviction right in the middle of ambiguity. And that really brings us to the central question, one I'm sure many of us have wrestled with, especially when we're in a position of responsibility. How do we decide to act? How do we commit to a direction when we just can't know the outcome for sure? You know, when all the data you wish you had simply isn't there yet. Well, this leads us right into something we could call the certainty trap. And it's a completely natural human instinct, right? We want to de-risk everything. We tell ourselves, if I just do a little more research, if I can get one more report, then I can eliminate the unknown. Have you ever found yourself stuck in that loop of analysis? I know I have. But the truth is, especially when we're talking about the truly important ventures, the most critical pieces of the puzzle just can't be solved with a spreadsheet. Those game-changing decisions, the kind that can define a career or create a whole new category, well, you just can't prove they're right before you make them.
And you can really see two fundamentally different mindsets here. On one side, you have this impulse to wait for a perfect map. It's driven by the belief that you can solve the problem of risk with enough information. But on the other side, there's the approach of just starting the journey, which is grounded in this very different understanding, that the most valuable knowledge isn't found in planning, it's found in the actual doing.
And that brings us to a really pivotal and, maybe a counterintuitive idea. Action actually precedes clarity. The very understanding that we're searching for. It isn't a prerequisite to get moving, it's a consequence of it. And here it is. This is the core insight. Just let that sink in for a second. The very data you're waiting for to feel confident can only be created by making the decision in the first place. It completely reframes the whole situation, doesn't it? The choice isn't really between knowing and not knowing, it's between staying where you are and creating the conditions where you can actually learn something. So the whole point is that movement is what unlocks learning. Every single step, even if it feels like a misstep, gives you feedback. It turns what was a theoretical problem into a very practical one. And in doing so, it reveals the real obstacles and the real opportunities, things that were completely invisible from back at the starting line. This is really how you navigate complexity, with a sense of calm and intention, by actually engaging with. Now, of course, this isn't an argument for just being reckless. It's not about charging blindly into the fog. It's about having the right tool for that kind of journey. It's about carrying a compass, not a map. A map shows you every detail, but a compass just gives you a direction.
And we can give a name to this tool, guided conviction. It's really about finding a balance, It's having the courage to commit to a direction, to an idea that you truly believe in, but balancing that with the wisdom and the humility to learn as you go, to adjust your course based on the feedback your actions are giving you. It's a very dynamic process.
And let's be really clear about this. In the world that we're all operating in now, where the pace of change just consistently outruns our ability to gather perfect data, this kind of mindset isn't just a nice-to-have advantage anymore. It's fast becoming a fundamental necessity for both survival and for real growth. So then, how does this way of thinking actually build something that lasts? When we kind of zoom out and look at the legacy of this mindset, we see it isn't just about making one-off decisions, it's about how truly enduring organizations and influential careers are forged in that very fire of ambiguity. This is something that's so important to really internalize. The most effective leaders, the real builders, they aren't immune to doubt. They feel it just like the rest of us. The difference is their relationship with that doubt. They don't see it as a stop sign. They just see it as part of the terrain you have to cross, and they hold on to their commitment to keep moving forward anyway. And so we arrive at this really powerful synthesis. We often think that we need to find clarity before we can have courage. But what if they're actually two sides of the same coin? What if the kind of clarity that really matters is only born from the courage it takes to act without it? They don't oppose each other. In a way, they create each other. And that leaves us with a final thought to reflect on. The giants of industry, the groundbreaking movements, they weren't built on a foundation of perfect information. They were built on the conviction behind an enduring idea, one that was pursued with enough courage to navigate all the uncertainty that surrounds things that truly matter. So the question for us is, what's the enduring idea that you're willing to pursue even without a perfect map?